Okay, so hello, Martina. My name is Elke Schüssler. I'm part of the Utopia platform, and today I have Professor Martina Linnenluecke with me from the Macquarie University, where she heads the Center for Corporate Sustainability and Environmental Finance. So she's an expert on sustainability-related issues more broadly, particularly also in relation to environmental finance. But today we have Martina with us to talk about a concept that has been really important in the context of the sustainability debate, and it has become a bit of a buzzword also now in the light of the COVID crisis, which is the concept of resilience. So Martina has taken some minutes today after the end of a long workday for her in Australia to talk to us about resilience. And Martina is an expert on it and known for being an expert on this mainly because of two publications, a book she authored in 2015 called The Climate Resilient Organization, and then also a very comprehensive literature review on the concept, which she published in 2017, and which is the core reference right now for anyone who is doing research on resilience. So Martina, let's jump right in. And I want to ask the very basic question, what is resilience? Everyone talks about it. So what is it?
Yeah, thanks so much, Elke, for the opportunity to join this interview today. We have obviously seen, in particular, in just the recent months during the coronavirus crisis in particular, that obviously everyone became really, really interested in this idea of resilience, right? And I think in particular due to the current situation that we are in, right? We are facing very unprecedented challenges. We are facing very, very difficult situation with a lot of economic uncertainty, a lot of uncertainty for people personally. So people are trying to find, I think, some hope and some optimism, some new directions, how to recover, how to go forward. So I think consequently, we've seen a lot of interest in this idea of resilience. So from my review in 2017 in the International Journal of Management Reviews, you can probably see that there is not necessarily one sort of straightforward definition of this particular concept, but overall I think we can sort of define resilience as the ability to bounce back or recover after encountering substantial hardship or after encountering an adverse situation. So usually we find that definitions are centering around those ideas. So how do we recover? How do we bounce back? How do we actually proceed after encountering a really challenging situation? And that sort of concept has been applied at multiple different levels. So from the individual level, right to the organizational level, industry level, but also to the system level, so to ecological systems, for example. So ultimately, the idea really is to study how do individual businesses, how do ecosystems, how do we bounce back after encountering a very challenging situation. So I would say that's probably at the heart of organizational resilience research. There are definitely different definitions of the concept depending on the particular situation, but I'm more than happy to go into that in a bit further detail during our discussion.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. So I mean that's really interesting. So it's bouncing back after something negative happens, but it's a bit like when we talk about crisis management too. It's sort of the stuff that happens after the crisis, and the way you react depends a lot on how you've prepared, right? So what actually you've done before the negative event has happened. Is that something that is important for becoming resilient as well? So what do you actually do before a crisis happens so that you can be resilient in the crisis?
Yeah, I think definitely this idea of regarding preparedness prior to the event versus the ability to bounce back afterwards, I think these two sort of ideas, there's currently probably a bit of a tension in the literature regarding this, right? So I think resilience is often defined as reactions towards the unknown, the unexpected, right? Unexpected circumstances. We see that a lot coming out of the work, for example, of Wyckoff, Sutcliffe. There's always this idea that something unexpected is happening, right? So obviously, if we are fully anticipating the situation to come, we are not necessarily faced with the unexpected, we are faced with the expected, right? So I see that definitely a lot of the sort of like crisis preparedness, crisis management literature is more focused on preparing for an anticipated crisis. Not exclusively, there are definitely also approaches that go a bit bigger and try to prepare for the unexpected. But I think it's always really, really difficult to foresee every type of possible future situation, right? So, I mean, if we were sort of, trying to teleport ourselves back into the past, maybe a year or two ago, I think none of us would have really anticipated the current situation, right? So I think, yes, of course, everyone has read literature about a pandemic might occur, or we might see global health challenges or whatnot. But I don't really think that a lot of companies or a lot of people, a lot of individuals, or even a lot of policymakers have really taken this seriously to the extent that we were starting to fully prepare for the current situation. And to some extent, it's also not possible, right? We possibly can't prepare for every unforeseen situation that we might encounter, right? Because I think otherwise we would also put a lot of resources in terms of, preparation towards natural disasters, all sorts of possible crises that could occur, terrorist attacks, other types of shock, economic downturns. I mean, there's such an endless array of possibilities as well, what makes it really, really hard to be fully prepared for each and every situation. And it's not just those macro type of shocks. It can also be, smaller types of accidents or disasters that happen to companies or to a sector, right? So in a more confined kind of way. I think just the broad possibilities that we have in terms of, what can happen, what can go wrong, what's the unexpected that might actually happen, that really, really makes it so challenging to be prepared for each and every of these types of scenarios, right? So that's why I sometimes see where the crisis management or crisis preparedness ends and where resilience comes in. It's sort of, what happens if we encounter a new situation, an unexpected event that we didn't fully foresee, and now we have to make sense out of it, out of that particular situation, as we are finding ourselves in this developing situation, right? And then we have to think about new ways. We have to think about different ways of how we can operate, how we can actually now proceed. And I mean, to some extent, I think the current situation is also really interesting because the situation is not necessarily a crisis that has got a destructive potential in a physical sense, right? So we are not experiencing the type of physical destruction we would see after a natural disaster, but we are seeing a lot of disruption in terms of, the social networks that we have, in terms of the economic consequences. So again, it's giving us a very unexpected situation. I think a lot of people have never found themselves in a situation where they feel so disconnected and isolated, and where they can't really access their normal networks and their normal ways of living and operating, right? And I think this is where resilience really comes in, this sort of unexpected new situation, right? Where we really have to learn how to make sense out of this unexpected and new situation, to then find out how can we now respond, right? How can we react to this? What can we actually do now to go forward, to survive this, to recover from this, or perhaps even do things differently in the future, right? So what does it mean for ultimately, this ranges from managing the individual company, this relates to, how we essentially manage our individual lives, to much larger questions around, economic resilience, supply chain resilience, and so on.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I mean, we can talk a little bit about the current crisis situation because it's a good test and illustrator for the concept. But of course, also I want to talk about the climate crisis because that's also what you're an expert on and where the concept is used a lot. So here I guess we have both. We can expect that bad things will happen if we believe in the climate crisis, but we don't know exactly when it will hit and how it will hit and whom it will hit, right? So I suppose that's also a really good case where we need resilience, but we cannot specifically prepare for a specific event exactly, right? So how can we become resilient? What does an organization have to do, knowing that there might be adverse natural effects? Let's look at Australia, for example, where of course some of these effects are already directly felt. We know something will happen, but we don't know exactly when and how. So
yeah.
that was one.
I think one really important aspect of actually becoming, resilient is, first of all, to really engage with the problem at hand, right? Not to put this out of our minds. I think sometimes when we face challenging situations, it's so easy to sort of make this a future problem, right? It's not really happening today. It's not really impacting us right now. And, just today, I was actually on a phone call with someone from industry, and they were trying to figure out how they can really ultimately plan for different types of climate scenarios. And I think this is also really challenging, right? Because we don't really have that 100% future certainty around what's going to happen. Also because we don't really have full knowledge yet of how exactly climate change plays out, but also it's still in our hands to influence the outcomes as well. So to some extent, it's a moving target, right? So if we can mitigate more climate change, so if we can avoid further emissions, mitigate those emissions, reduce climate change impacts, then we obviously have less of a need to adapt to the negative impacts of climate change in the future, right? So in a way, it's also like a little bit of this sort of trade-off that's happening there between what we can do now and what's going to happen in the future as well. So I think for me, the starting point is definitely to engage with this issue today, right? So ultimately that means to really look into what does that mean for a company, what does that mean for a particular industry. And obviously no one will have all the right answers, but I think this sort of, recognition that there is a problem, I think is a really, really important part of it, right? And this already allows companies and industries to plan ahead and to recognize really important future trends that can happen, right? So we already know that there will definitely be areas that are going to be worse affected in terms of, adverse temperature shocks, right? We know absolutely for certain that if we don't do anything, there will be negative consequences. I mean, you mentioned Australia, right, for the Great Barrier Reef, which will have associated consequences for tourism. So there's a lot of knowledge that we do actually already have in place. And I think what's really important in terms of resilience is that we are thinking now, what can we do in order to, adjust business models, right? So first of all, to avoid further contributions to climate change, which means that we really need to look into very rapid shift away from fossil fuel intensive industries, right? So these are definitely also responses that can be driven by sensible policies in this space, right? So again, it brings us to a multi-level issue and situation here. But for companies, I think it's also really important to recognize, okay, are we operating in areas that might be affected, right? So is there already a disruption that we can foresee in the future, and what can we do if this disruption should occur? Do we actually have an alternative here to adjust our business models in a way that we do have some alternative available to us, right? So I think this is really, for me, where this resilience thinking starts, right? Again, I don't think we can fully prepare for any particular given disaster, right? So I said that the other day when I was on a panel, right? And I had a couple of climate skeptics, I would call them, in the audience, right? And I said, of course, I can't tell you exactly, in April 2027, right? Some, cyclone will hit this particular location, or this heat wave will hit this exact area of Australia, wherever in the world, right? But what we can definitely see are trends here, right? We've seen these mega wildfires happening in Australia and the US as well now. I mean, this is a super concerning trend, right? So we know that these changes are creating a very challenging situation, right? So I think this is definitely a strong call for action. We are seeing other types of changes all over the globe. And I think for companies, there's really the question now, okay, what can we actually do in terms of, change our preparedness, in terms of, what's our contribution to climate change, what's our contribution to this problem, how can we mitigate our own involvement here, but also what can we actually do in order to develop the business that we have away from these threats, right? Because I mean, this is definitely going to be a really, really problematic situation in the future. And we see sectors that are going to be more impacted, and they are the ones that are directly dependent on the natural environment, right? It's tourism, it's agriculture, to some extent, definitely also the travel industry, the transportation sector, right? So, I mean, these are all sectors that are going to be really, really heavily exposed to these types of changes. And I think thinking about new forms of business, but also new forms of how we can actually create resilience in the society will be really, really important here to go forward.
Yeah, that's really interesting that you mentioned these two, mitigation and adaptation concepts, because I would have thought resilience is much more about adaptation, but if I understood you correctly, it's actually also very prospective in a sense that it includes trying to mitigate wherever possible. Is that correct?
Yeah, look, I think we've got that knowledge at our disposal at the moment, right? That if we mitigate climate change, or at least to the degree that this is still possible, we can avoid some of the, hopefully, some of the super adverse impacts of climate change, right? So, I mean, this is knowledge that we have at the moment, which is at our disposal. This is scientifically confirmed knowledge, right? And so I think just ignoring this knowledge is definitely pushing us into a situation where we might see a decline of our own resilience. So I would definitely see that there's an interconnectedness to that. In that extent, right? Especially if we talk about societal resilience. If we want to build future resilient societies, we should really base our current preparedness on the best available scientific evidence that we do have available. And the best scientific evidence says it is time to act now. So if we really want to build more resilient societies in the future, I think this is going to be really important to factor that in. And ultimately, right, it's going to be disproportionately affecting some parts of the population. Definitely when we look into developing countries where vital resources are lacking in terms of, providing some adaptation support, mitigation support, and so on, I think there's definitely also raises a lot of question in terms of, the distributional impacts that we're actually seeing in terms of climate change, right? I mean, here in the developed part of the world, we do have funding available, right? We do have more engineering knowledge available. We've got other resources at our disposal. And yeah, to some extent, that's probably also, comparable to the COVID responses that we are seeing, right? So often people in more privileged positions have been finding it easier to cope with the impacts, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, that's very interesting. So let's maybe try and look at some examples to make the ideas a bit more tangible. Let's maybe look at three different contexts. So your book was called the Climate Resilient Organization. So can you give an example maybe from your book of what you would say is a good example for climate resilient organization? And then let's maybe look at a more systemic level. Here we can use COVID as an example. So there's a lot of talk about resilient supply chains, for example. So can you have an example for that? And of course, there's also the individual level, as you mentioned. So what would be a resilient person for situations like pandemics or climate change? I think it matters for both.
Yeah. Yeah, so in terms of the book, I mean, the whole idea was really at the time, I think there was just nothing in the literature really that was, or at least from a sort of theoretical angle where we would say, okay, this is providing guidance for companies and for managers to look into actually addressing climate change, right? And to try to build some level of resilience. I mean, to some extent, I see really the challenging impact of climate change, that it ultimately creates that change in extremes, which I think is going to be the most impactful part of climate change, right? I mean, there will definitely be long-term consequences as well, from gradual increases in temperature, right, in terms of water stress impacts on agriculture and so on. But I think particularly threatening is going to be the tail end. I mean, when I was writing this book back in the days, we definitely didn't have the experience of the bushfires available, right? These mega catastrophes, right? And I mean, just being in Australia when it happened, I must say that sort of, you know, made me really think a lot about resilience and what we can actually do to address these types of changes, right? Again, I think many companies were really faced with this unprecedented situation, right? So a really rapid, sudden change. With this particular situation, I think there was also the experience that, you know, there was often a very rapid impact on a particular area, right? The disaster was striking very fast, in a very unprecedented way, and for many communities and for many businesses and individuals as well, was completely eradicating the livelihood, right? Creating a really, really challenging situation. So again, this created, I think, this challenge of how do we recover from this, right? Yeah, we've seen some examples where people have been able to do this relatively quickly, but I think we've also seen examples where this didn't happen, right? And where there have been people, I mean, this is still an ongoing issue in many communities, that they have simply not been able to recover, in particular also due to this compound impact together with COVID, right? A lot of I think the regions that got struck as well were highly dependent, for instance, on tourism, right? And then the next disaster hit and the tourists were taken away in the Australian context because their borders were closed, or are still closed actually, due to international travel here in Australia at the moment. So consequently, I think creating a real sort of, you know, double whammy in terms of the impacts and the lasting consequences, which I think it becomes really, really challenging to look into recovery. There's obviously also a lot of personal trauma that needs to be addressed, right? I mean, just living through, I had colleagues directly affected by the bushfires, right? And I can see, I mean, the personal impact that this has on people is I think, very, very traumatic as well. So I think there's also a lot of need to actually work through this from a psychological level, to really cope with, you know, losing your belongings, you being under threat, your house is under attack, your livelihood is under attack, right? So I think there's definitely a lot of this sort of like need to look at this from a psychological level as well here. I mean, this experience we definitely didn't have when at the time, you know, when the book came out. But I think, again, the book was sort of, you know, this attempt, again, to look at this tension that I mentioned earlier between adaptation and mitigation, right? So to look into what's happening on the mitigation side. Are we actually making enough progress at the moment with really mitigating climate change? Yes, to some extent, we are seeing some promising policy signals, but overall I remain skeptical if we really can turn this around in time, right? Because I mean, we do see in a lot of instances that we are not acting fast enough. The energy transition is not happening rapidly enough, right? We still have got very large developing economies that are very fossil fuel dependent. So I think I remain skeptical there as well. And then, yeah, the book also looked at the adaptation issue, right? So what can we actually then do once we see the impacts of climate change, to look into adaptation responses there as well. But yeah, I think the biggest issue is probably really this, the adjustment to unprecedented climate disasters. And yeah, the bushfires definitely being one example for those. So I think that's definitely been creating a lot of challenges, in particular for businesses to rebuild from nothing. And yeah, in a lot of instances, unfortunately, right, it's really only possible with insurance payouts or state support or other type of support, you know. But I think we are also seeing this in the coronavirus situation at the moment, that state responses are limited in some extent as well, right? The state obviously can't just keep pumping money into the economy. While this was a short-term response, it's been taken by a lot of governments around the world. This will, I mean, ultimately come to an end at some point, right? Because no government has those deep pockets to keep that going for years and years to come. Again, I think we're seeing a multi-level issue here, right? Where resilience so far has been supported by government action as well, or other types of, levels. So insurance, for instance, in case of the bushfires. But I think these are some mechanisms that are supporting potential recovery, right? But again, also mechanisms, I think, where we see limits in terms of their longevity and their ability, right? I mean, so to look into some more specific examples of what we've actually seen, what companies are doing. We have recently published a piece in The Conversation where we go through some examples. So that was jointly with Brent McKnight from Macquarie University. And so we've been reflecting there as well on what companies can actually do in terms of, creating resilience. This piece was particularly focused on the COVID response. But I think some of the lessons learned that can potentially also be applied to other types of scenarios. And yeah, we ultimately looked at various elements. One of them was to look into changes in business responses. And what we saw was definitely that, companies that were able to adapt business models really quickly were the ones that showed this type of resilience, right? So ultimately, I think the challenge became, how do we navigate around that situation where we have got ultimately no longer this ability to have this physical contact with our customers, right? And I mean, we've seen some great examples here from companies trying to make this work, right? I mean, in the simplest sort of form, this was restaurants shifting to takeaway options. But I think we've also seen a lot of companies really exploring, online opportunities, ultimately new delivery models. And again, that really came down to testing our supply chains in terms of, how can we use alternative forms of delivery to connect with the customer. We've definitely seen a lot of, I think, online responses, which definitely is limited to particular types of businesses as well. But I think the other aspect, what we also found is that, companies that had flexible arrangements or that were able to embrace flexibility were also doing a lot better during the crisis, right? So I think some companies were really struggling with this whole workforce transition from one day to the next. I mean, we had that situation here that we had to lock down the entire university very, very rapidly. And I think a lot of academics can probably relate to that situation, right, where we had to completely change what we were doing in a very rapid fashion. Again, some companies and some organizations were definitely better prepared to deal with this, right? Just in terms of, the setup, the mindset that people were bringing to this. And also, I think the flexibility was really important. I think we've seen some companies really struggling with this because they did not have this sort of like flexibility to allow people to shift what they were doing, right? Whereas like other companies had already been experimenting with different types of flexible setups and whatnot. We've seen some examples, I think, that were really interesting, where companies were really considering ultimately what it is that they were doing, right? So in terms of their product and service delivery, where they were not just making marginal adaptations to their business model, marginal adjustments, but where they were really sort of shifting the products and services they were offering, right? So for instance, distilleries suddenly producing hand sanitizer, I think that was, a really good example. Or perfume manufacturers or companies, right, doing the same thing to really look into, okay, where's the current need at the situation, right? Where as the company can we really make a difference to society, to really adapt to the need of customers. So I thought that was really interesting. It's obviously more challenging in situations here where we do see other types of crises, right? So I mean, coming back to the bushfire recovery, that's probably a little bit harder to do, to adapt these types of models and adjustments, in particular if there's been a physical destruction of the actual business, right? Again, we have seen some companies shifting there as well to online solutions, right? So when the physical store or the physical location of the company was disrupted. But I think it's definitely been harder in situations where people have been hit both professionally and personally, right? Because it does take away a lot from this personal resilience. And I think that probably brings us to the question also around, the personal side of things. I think this is a very interesting line, and I've looked into this, right? It's really around the personal strengths of people and how they recover. And I think it very much comes down, to the individual and their particular situation. We can see that there are some traits that people have. So for instance, their sort of, attitude towards a particular situation, right? Whether or not they can approach something with the belief that they can recover from that particular scenario, right? But I mean, ultimately, individuals do not exist in isolation, right? It's really important to have that support network. And what we found there is, it's very important for people to live in, connected community that helps them, right? So this connection to others, where we shared experiences, right? It's very important to have helping hands, to have that support. So communities that are tighter connected or more tightly connected with each other, right? They seem to be overall doing better in these types of situations because individuals are not on their own. So we see a lot of this community support happening for businesses, right? Where essentially one person supports the other. Okay, you don't have this, I don't have that. How about we team up and we just make it happen together? We also see situations definitely where people have got better support in terms of, resources that they can access, counseling, government support, right, timely payouts from insurance companies. I think all of that is supporting communities as well in these disasters. I mean, there's just so many factors coming together, right? I think it's probably really difficult in a short interview to bring together all these personal factors that people might need in order to be more resilient. But I think definitely the support networks we see are super important, in particular in situations where people have really lost their livelihood personally, but also, their businesses or other types of aspects of their lives.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a really important aspect. You mentioned this multi-level nature of the concept, right? So because it's easy to say, well, okay, so you're not recovering as an individual or organization, so you don't have the right attitude or you didn't have the right structure, but it doesn't seem to be that easy. Resilience does seem to depend a lot on the support network you have, either interpersonal on an individual level or, like you said, kind of government support as well, right? There needs to be a help structure in place to help people and organizations recover.
Yeah. I mean, I think it can become very challenging, in particular for individuals as well who experience mental problems in these types of situations, right? And I think that's very relatable, especially if you had significant personal losses. There is no way that you can simply just quickly develop a positive attitude.
Exactly.
This is, I mean, just a completely wrong approach. But I think to actually allow these individuals then to connect with others, and to make sure that there is a supporting community in place, I think this is definitely really important, right? And we see that in a lot of situations that, communities that do provide this type of support are ultimately able to provide better structures. I mean, it does certainly also come down to the individual and their resources, right? Someone who's got more financial resources, better education, is more connected, has got, different setup in their personal life. I mean, we definitely see different situations there as well.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. That's really interesting. So let's maybe take a sort of future-oriented look, because we're trying to figure out utopian thoughts, right? Utopian visions for a more sustainable future. So what do you think? Is resilience a concept for the future that will lead us towards a more sustainable society?
I hope so. I mean, I think at this point in time, right, we're really facing the big challenges and the big questions about, where we're going to be headed as a society, right? I mean, we've just experienced one massive shock, and I think honestly, climate change is not that far off from being the next one, right? We can already see all the signs that are there. So I think we really need to think about, how as a society are we becoming more resilient to what these impacts. But yes, I see that definite connection there as well with sustainability, right? So how can we actually make sure that we embark on a pathway that is not taking away from our ability to be resilient in the future? And yes, I think we need to see more sustainable responses. I think also as a society, we probably need to have discussions around, what's really important. And I think we've seen that just how interconnected our society is, or how interconnected our entire planet is essentially, and how fragile this entire system is, right? It didn't take much for the entire airline industry to break down. It really, really, really didn't take much at all, right? And even though we would have probably seen this as a very, sort of like global and robust industry, it took a few policy changes, and this entire industry was essentially just completely grounded, right? Interestingly enough, we see some very strange business models popping up at the moment, right, where companies are offering flights to nowhere. Yes, of course, on one hand, this is bringing in income. But on the other hand, I'm looking at this with the concern around what does that actually mean for the environmental impact if we are suddenly all starting to travel just for the sake of travel, right? For having this travel experience, which I think also gets us, to questions around our lifestyle and, a lot of these kind of questions as well. So I think probably in the future, I think, looking into a post-pandemic world and into a more resilient world in the future, I think we really need to think about, our supply chains, right? What is really essential, what is necessary, how can we produce what we need in a sustainable fashion, which probably means more locally, right? I think we also need to see how can we improve important aspects, health outcomes, for instance, right? I think the pandemic has really, really highlighted how important the health sector is and a functioning health sector. I think there's also been this realization companies that have better health systems and generally better, infrastructure in place were also the ones that had ultimately more resilience. Again, I think this is an important lesson learned here for the future. And I think where we probably also really need to see some thought is what are critical services, right? So what is the type of infrastructure that we need as a future society? And I think this comes down to transport, energy, telecommunications, health, education, right? These real fundamental pillars of our society. And I think we really need to think about how do we want to design those systems, and ultimately I think it also comes down to, questioning our lifestyle and lifestyle choices a little bit, right? I think for people it was really challenging to accept the fact that perhaps we are all a bit more grounded, and I see that in particular, where we see travel restrictions, right? It almost seems like people have not been able to stay local for some time. And it really surprises me, So to some extent, we also seem to have this, global lifestyle now in our head that we can just go everywhere, fly everywhere with zero consequences. Under a climate change scenario, we will probably, or an extreme climate change scenario, we will probably see many of these limitations to stay around, right? If we need to reduce carbon, we can't just bring back the airline industry as it was to the same extent. The same with the energy sector, the same with other types of carbon intensive sectors, right? So I think there's probably also the need here to just address some of our personal choices, right? And perhaps to make it cool not to have this, global and connected lifestyle, but to make it, cool to have a bit more of a sustainable lifestyle that ultimately takes, the societal needs into consideration as well.
Okay, thank you. Yes, so very, very multifaceted issue and running across multi-levels. So maybe a final question, because you gave this great example of the flights to nowhere. So, is there is the concept of resilience completely neutral? Doesn't it have a normative dimension? Would you say these companies offering flights to nowhere are resilient because they've recovered their business model quickly? Or they know they're not because we need to take the even longer term consequences into account?
Yeah, I've actually started to do some more work in this area, which hasn't been published yet. So, but it's really looking at that sort of question around. I think resilience per se is not necessarily suggesting that we need to make sustainable choices, right? I mean, the resilience literature, at the heart of this literature, is not necessarily the suggestion that resilient choices are automatically sustainable choices. I don't think that this is implied, right? In a lot of instances, resilience just means that economic recovery as well, right? We're bouncing back, we're recovering to where we were. And yes, for companies, this has been applied in particular in the economic sense of recovering profits, recovering from, breakdown or, destruction of profits, right? So it is, I think, in a lot of the organizational literature, very profit-oriented concept. And I don't think that this is necessarily problematic per se. But yes, I think there is the need to consider what that actually means in terms of other dimensions. I mean, in my 2017 paper, the resilience review, I'm sort of briefly alluding to the challenges, right, that we need to look further into issues around what does it actually mean to have resilient organizations that take away, potentially from our ability as a society to be resilient, right? Again, it's alluding to this multifaceted nature, right? So I think the fossil fuel industry is a very interesting one as well. It's definitely a very resilient one, right? It keeps sticking around. We have had lots of oil spills and other issues, right? Concerns around climate change and whatnot. The industry is still there, right? And I mean, it is, I mean, we could say it's been a pretty resilient industry, so they would probably been scoring really well if we would just look into the resilient dimensions of that industry, right? If we would score them against the sustainability sort of, framework, there would probably not be the same outcome or the same result, right? But again, I don't necessarily think that the resilience concept was introduced with the idea to measure resilience and vice versa. But going forward, I think we need to keep in mind that there's more than one dimension here that we need to look at.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you so much, Martina. Let's leave it at that.
Thank you.
And we look forward to hearing from you again, maybe as you continue your research on this multifaceted nature of resilience. Okay, so bye.
Yes, thank you so much for the opportunity to talk to you today. And look forward to seeing the interview when it's being published. Thank you.
Thank you.